Now then, it's time for today's perspective. And if you follow news from Africa, you'll know that it's just a week since an attempted coup was foiled in the northwestern African country of Sudan. The authorities blaming what they call forces of darkness linked to President Omar al-Bashir, who was ousted as president 2 years ago after 3 decades in power. Now, since his ousting, a military and civilian power-sharing government has been in power to, in theory, see a new transition to democracy amid ongoing fighting in the country. Meanwhile, in the separate country of South Sudan, formed in a peace agreement with Sudan a decade ago, were thousands of people displaced there amid ethnic fighting and civil war. Life in both countries then inevitably very tough. My guest today was an aid worker in Sudan's capital, Khartoum, in the early 2000s, when he admits he understood very little about the country. That, though, has changed. He's now co-director of the University of Cambridge's Centre of Governance and Human Rights, author of the book When Peace Kills: Politics, International Intervention and Understanding Wars in the Sudans. Thanks very much for joining us on the programme, Sharath Srinivasan. Explain the title, first of all, When Peace Kills Politics. What do you mean by that?
Well, what I want to convey with that is that sometimes in the effort to make peace, to put efforts into negotiations between warring parties, to bring them to some kind of deal where they share power or share wealth, and to put forward a constitutional reform or a plan for democratic elections, etc. All that effort to making peace has this really paradoxical and troubling effect sometimes to just reintroduce the logic of violence and raise the currency of violence. And I explain why that happened in the Sudans, where we had multiple peacemaking interventions over many decades, and yet recurrent civil wars and authoritarianism across the countries.
So can you go as far then as to saying what's happened in both countries is as a direct result of that? In other words, it's sort of the international community's fault?
No, I wouldn't go that far as well, but rather just for us to have a sober look at what it is in a sense, the tragic nature of peacemaking, which is in the very attempt to bring about a transformation in politics away from coercion, away from civil war and violence. The very means that we have available end up being interventions into the country's politics. And those interventions tend to privilege the positionalities of belligerent actors who are brought to the table to make deals. And they tend to always defer to a later time the space for civil politics, for more plural voices to come into the picture. And so in that very attempt to bring about peace, it tends to lock others out. And those who are more marginalized find that the language of violence tends to be more valued by those who are shaping the politics in the country. And thus violence and politics intertwine yet again and push out the space for a non-violent civil politics. I think international peacemakers have a very vexed and challenging role in civil wars, and especially in the Sudans. So it's not as easy as laying blame on one side or the other. But we have to come to a closer understanding of how things can go wrong if we're going to think differently about what we can do with peacemaking.
Well, let's talk a bit about each country individually. I mean, Sudan, as I mentioned, they're just coming out of another failed coup attempt. I mean, there have been so many, haven't there? The country's just so unstable.
It is very unstable, and we had these revolutionary events of 2018 and 2019. President Omar al-Bashir was deposed from power, and it was a civilian uprising that really brought about change. It wasn't actually peacemaking. And now out of that came the need to make a deal with some of the erstwhile members of the government of President Omar al-Bashir, and a transitional council was created in government. And that's a pretty unstable hodgepodge of a range of different forces. There was a peace agreement afterwards to end some of the civil wars that were going on. And it's brought together into the swirling space of government, of a transitional state, a range of different forces and actors, and some who are also outside and who are locked out. So we're in a case in Sudan where instability and precariousness is at the very heart of a process of change and transformation. So it is, at risk of going in the wrong direction as much as it's possible that it could really transform the country out of these unending wars.
And unfortunately, all those adjectives that you're using there, they apply to South Sudan as well, don't they?
They do apply to South Sudan, but South Sudan's a very different case because in South Sudan, what you have is, again, the legacies of these elite peace deals that bring and give power to some of the primary foes who are armed. And so whereas in Sudan, you have this unstable, fertile space of politics and transition and possibility and hope, as well as despair and precariousness. In South Sudan, you have this real lack of change, or lack of transformation, that actually peacemaking remains this dominant way of thinking about what to do in the country. Very, very tragic circumstances for the civilians, but no sense that there's a political process to get out of this situation, this predicament, and actually renewed fighting between various forces.
Once you've understood the reasons then behind all of this, I mean, are there causes for optimism? And I mean, can you see any way out of the current situation in either country?
I can. I mean, for me, the lodestar of what was possible really is the revolutionary events of Sudan of 2018, 2019. Because what we saw there, which was really missing in the many decades of elite peacemaking and international interventions, what we saw there was the irrepressible ability for people to come together and claim power and assert their voice and seek change. And so the many thousands, indeed millions, who took to the streets across Sudan to achieve the transformations of 2019 represented what can happen in certain world historical moments when change comes that's led by the citizenry. Now, that's not a new thing in Sudan. There have been intifadas or civilian uprisings in the history of Sudan's post-independence politics, and they haven't always ended well. Within a few years, there have been military coups. There's been a reassertion of authoritarian government. So we are living in circumstances where there is possibility, there is hope, but there is also a history of things not quite working out. And I think a lot of those lessons are being learned and thought about by the current leaders within Sudan. And it's really incumbent upon the international community, I think, to take as much positive out of this process of transition and support and foster it as much as possible.
Yeah, and just bearing in mind, though, what you said at the top, I mean, is it good, though, that the international community continues to get involved, as you say, bearing in mind that it can go so horribly wrong?
Well, I mean, we live in a deeply intertwined and interdependent world. So there's no question that the international community can, in a sense, leave Sudan. I mean, this region, Northeast Africa, is highly volatile, is highly strategically important. There are a lot of interests, and there are a lot of humanitarian concerns as well. So no one's about to leave. We are where we are, and we have to start there and think differently about what we can do. And I think there's a lot of attention and thoughtfulness going into how do we support this process of transition and not, in a sense, disrupt it by trying to do too much, by allowing politics, civil politics, people coming together to reconstitute their country, their polity, their nation, to allow that politics to be, positive and generative, supporting it in key ways like minimizing economic hardship that can, be challenging, or allowing for, smart, thoughtful support to the state as it currently is to reduce threats of coup or coercion sort of coming in. There are lots of things that can be done. There's things around the fiscal situation of the country. There's support to civilian forces and political parties. There's ways of generating and fostering the trajectory that the Sudanese themselves are on.
Thanks very much. Good to talk to you today. Good to end on that positive note as well. And Peace Kills Politics is the name of the book. Sharath Srinivasan joining us there. Thanks.